Howdy folks, this is going to be chapter 2 of Arizona Springtime, and I'll just go ahead and start right in. Chapter 2, Perspectives on a Forest. From a view far above, the forest would have appeared isolated, an island, surrounded by railroad tracks, concrete, asphalt, automobiles, homes and businesses. At the time, I would never have thought to appreciate the fact that there was a forest amid a suburban area. At the time, I was ignorant of forest history. I did not know that old-growth forests that were once plentiful had become rare. Later, I gained knowledge from sources such as documents, diaries, and books that yielded the uncomfortable truth. Those were in opposition to culture, history as taught in schools, and casual observation. The truth changed my views and my personal philosophy. Books are a way to gain the truth, and I have used them to broaden my access to nature through avenues that were closed. Like the gateless gate of Japanese koans, I could not see the truth until I could. Annie Proulx, in her book Barkskins, bears the soul of the corrupt timber industry that struck the New World before there were colonies. Her deeply disturbing but accurate book covers the entire destructive history to the present day. The ocean of trees that covered America was reduced over time to a few isolated old-growth outposts. Conrad Richter, in his The Awakening Land trilogy, wrote about the more subtle transformation from an ocean of trees, followed innocently enough into fertile farm fields, and finishes the evolution with the growth of a small town. In the first book, he follows the life of pioneer girl Sarah Wheeler. In the second book, she is married, and in the final installment, she is a respected elderly lady. The claustrophobic trees in the first book are so scary it drives Sarah's mother insane. They are seen as an enemy to human life. The second book sees cleared trees and the great joy of the pioneers as they welcome the open sky above their newly planted fields. In the final book, the elderly Sarah looks upon her death, gazes outside upon a tree. It grew in her yard despite the town that subsumed her homestead. In her last moments, she realized she longed for those early days with an ocean of trees. Sadly, they were gone. Although works of fiction, these books began to alter my philosophy of the world, away from a suburban cultural identity into a philosophy with me coalesced with the natural world. Historically, there was a transformation in the United States. Upon arrival in the New World, Europeans set up a culture that hung onto the ancient trade route ideas of society and the exploitation of natural resources for short-term economic and selfish gain. Many from Europe viewed trees as something to conquer or as a commodity with economic benefits. It took a long time before trees were viewed in a different light. Thomas Jefferson played a role in that transformation with his interest in horticulture. His point of contact on the fledgling science was William Hamilton from Philadelphia. Hamilton was a collector of plants from all over the world. In an act to promote that collection, Jefferson sent Hamilton seeds from the recently concluded Lewis and Clark expedition that sent them to the far horizons of the newly explored Far West. Following Hamilton's death, Andrew Jackson Downey from the Hudson River area helped to redefine an American view of trees. He promoted the recognition that trees were endangered. Then more people began to see trees differently. They began to walk a spiritual and philosophical path that viewed trees as a natural beauty. In cities, people promoted trees as a way to add cool shade. But in the political capital of Washington, D.C., the local poor had no choice but to cut down the trees along the city's avenues for cooking and heating fuel. Local residents with money and or land grew trees or had cords of wood delivered, lamented that the beautiful trees were leveled and made into unsightly stumps. Just having the recognition that the loss of trees in cities was a problem meant trees were being viewed as desirable. Still, there was a way to go before a majority of people began to see the value of trees beyond economic. Upon Downing's untimely death, an idea popularized through education helped to bring about an American cultural change. Arbor Day, a tree planting day, traces its roots to the Midwest. Arbor Day was an invention of J. Sterling Morton. Morton had settled on a 160-acre homestead in Nebraska Territory. In April 1855, he envisioned a forest on his property amid the tall grass prairie that spread in all directions to the horizon beyond his property. Neighbors considered him an eccentric and scoffed at the idea. Morton reasoned that if one tree could provide shade for someone, then many trees would act as a natural cooling effect against the relentless heat of Nebraska summers. Over time, as citizens and politicians across America recognized that a moral right can outweigh the archaic economic wrong, they adopted Arbor Day as an official holiday. As each generation of children were taught to respect trees, the culture transformed from ignorance into appreciation. Those children, as they became adults, passed on their philosophy to save trees. Francis Parkman summarized the change when he wrote in 1885, quote, "The early settler regarded the forest as an enemy to be overcome by any means, fair or foul, as the first condition of his prosperity and safety, and his descendants do not yet comprehend how completely the conditions are changed. The old enemy has become an indispensable friend and ally." End quote. For me, the forest preserve helped to change my understanding of nature and philosophically transform me. The forest preserve was an historical invention. In the Chicago area, the transformation into appreciation for trees took place around the turn of the 20th century. The timing for the change was rather late when compared to some eastern metropolitan areas. For Chicago, the change began with the 1892 Chicago World's Fair. There began a dawn of realization for Chicagoans that natural beautification amid steel mills and factories was an indicator of healthy commerce and wealth in a metro area. That's right. Industry by itself was no longer acceptable as an economic indicator. Beautification was. At the time, Chicago was far down the list of cities that had devoted parks and open recreation areas for the local populace to enjoy. Boston became a leader in how the rich in a city should express wealth. They set aside natural areas, and the wealthy of Chicago took notice. A law was passed in 1913 after several corrupted attempts that defined an outer belt of parks around Chicago. The Forest Preserve in Glenwood is part of the historic Cook County districts. After the formation of the preserves, Cook County divided the forests into regions, and Glenwood Woods North is part of Region 9, Southeast Cook County. Since that time, authors of books that acknowledge nature as part of their lives have helped me identify the entrance into the forest or natural realm as a change exiting from a world solely designed by humans. The city and suburban assault on the senses gives way to the unlimited dimensions for the senses to enjoy in the natural world. Others who have gone into the wilderness or forest have varying perspectives and view the forest in a wide spectrum of reality. Many authors of nature and memoirs featuring nature have had a one-way discussion with me that transcends time. For instance, scientist and author Joan Maloof discussed animals in the forest. She described an animal's perspective with the forest as dependent upon how tall the animal's vision is. For example, a deer or human would have a different level of forest they will see versus the lower height of the muskrat. We humans see the forest at tree trunk level, as does a deer. The muskrat views the forest nearly at ground level. Maloof, through her writing, explained these new perspectives to me without having to directly talk to me. She goes on to say, we must also consider the invisible fourth dimension of time in order to truly understand a forest. She added to my knowledge that the forest is dimensional and we see it differently than other animals due to our earthbound 4 to 7 foot height. She suggested that readers enter the forest to transcend their day-to-day lives, use the forest to leave behind the day-to-day stresses. See a journey into the forest using all your senses and be open to learning what it offers. British author Richard Forte saw his entrance into the forest as something eternal. He saw upon entering a spiritualness and the natural power to restore his spirit. He could leave behind the defined life expected in the city. His entrance gave perspective that the small world of humans pales in so many ways to the larger world of the forest. He recalled his forested property in Britain one April. He explained how each tree became an individual to him. He saw in his forest some trees trying to crowd others out from the necessary sunshine, while other trees stood resolutely apart. He observed some trees carry scars, while others leaned over to grab a little more springtime sunlight. I learned from his reflections the minute but important subtlety of nature. Anthropologist Richard Nelson began his book by arriving by boat at a small forested island in the Haida Strait that fully entranced him. Amid the typical heavy rains in the area, he and his girlfriend explored the island, too big for one scouting trip. Although it was a new experience with its accompanying difficulties such as catching their dinner or starve, campfire cooking in the rain, and waking up in a cold and wet sleeping bag, he was transformed, and when they left the island, he looked back over his shoulder knowing he would return. From his anthropological background and interest in the local Native American cultural insights, he learned that he could see the ancient forest in its spiritual realm. He revealed how the Koyalan Native American people saw the land. We, as Westerners, may revere nature, much like walking into Notre Dame Cathedral. But the Koyukon believe that all of nature is sacred, and what we do in nature is as a witness of the sacred. God is nature, and not that God is in nature. Everything we do with our senses in a natural setting, such as his small remote island he explored and revered, is part of nature. Simple acts, such as splashing water in the face from a small stream or leaning against a tree, is part of the sacredness of nature. The touch of a branch is to touch sacredness. Sarah Stein, in her book, Noah's Garden, told me, as a reader, about the first time she went inside the forest on her property. She entered the forest with great excitement. It looked approachable. As she trekked deeper, though, the plants began to close in on her, and then tangled brush made it almost impossible to continue. In the end, she emerged disheveled and scraped, but optimistic. There is a human element that identifies our naivete when confronting nature and our perils. Yet she persisted, and from that persistence, she could see the changes needed in order to design a property that would fit biodiversity and make it humanly accessible. The legendary naturalist John Muir, in his book, The Mountains of California, wrote about entering into the canyons of Yosemite. Quote, "Here too, in the middle of a region of deepest canyons, are the grandest forest, trees, the sequoia, king of conifers, the noble sugar and yellow pines, Douglas spruce, Libos cedrus, and the silver firs, each a giant of its kind, assembled together in one and the same forest, surpassing all other coniferous forests in the world, both in the number of its species and the size and beauty of its trees. The winds flow into nullity through their colorful spires, and they are full everywhere with the songs of birds and running water. Miles of fragrant ceanothus and manzanita bushes bloom beneath them, and lily gardens and meadows, and damp fern in endless variety of fragrance and color, compelling the admiration of every observer. Sweeping on over ridge and valley, these noble trees extend a continuous belt from end to end of the range, only slightly interrupted by sheer walled canyons at intervals of about 15 and 20 miles." End quote. From that passage, he explained to me the biology and geology as an interaction between the living and non-living domains of nature. Although the book is over 100 years old, his wisdom transcends time, as does his philosophy. In spring 1953, naturalists Roger Torrey Peterson and James Fisher traveled 3,000 miles during a trip around North America. The co-author, James Fisher, was a naturalist from Britain. He wrote about his experience in a forest at the base of Mount Chapman in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He compared himself to Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She had shrunk and wanted to grow back to her correct size. As Fisher entered deeper into the forest, he wanted to grow to his right size as well. But the trees were so tall, he never did regain his size. He had never been a witness to a forest of 100-foot trees. He explained that the forests in Britain may have had tall trees, but not the vast numbers he was walking under. Fisher expressed to me his awe at the enormity of the American forest, and that the forest was a special place he could never experience in traveling through the landscapes of Britain. Author Colleen Marsluff wrote about her entrance into the Maine woods during a car trip. She commented on the unique properties of those forests and mountains as Muir had done about the forests and mountains of California. She contrasted the forests in Maine to those she had come from in Arizona. There was a wider diversity of tree species amid ancient rounded mountains that changed her own knowledge and definition of mountain and forest. I have witnessed the differences in landscape, but she told me how to notice the changes. From Joseph Conrad, I gained a new perspective of how our human world interacts with the natural world. As a young man, Conrad was an accomplished sailor. Although he wrote a reminiscence of his sailing life over 100 years ago, his words echo truth. As a young sailor, he understood that as ships left port, captains and sailors left their world behind. They left the familiar and entered another world, of the sea. Quote, "The departure is distinctly a ceremony of navigation. A ship may have left port some time before. She may have been at sea, in the fullest sense of the phrase, 4 days, but for all that, as long as the coast she was about to leave remained in sight, had not in the sailor's sense begun the enterprise of a passage. The taking of departure, if not the last sight of land, is perhaps the last profession of all recognition of the land on the part of the sailor. It is the technical as distinguished from the sentimental goodbye. It is a matter personal to the man. It is not the ship that takes her departure. The seaman takes his departure." End quote. Conrad, at the very least, identified that departure is changing from one perspective to another. Having left the human world of the port, he moved into the natural rhythm of life on the open seas. He does touch upon the arrival into the world of the sea, but he recognized the departure from the social ties as an emotional impact for all captains and sailors. My great-grandfather was a sailor from the Shetland Islands. His reminiscences include reports on some ports he visited. Although they were far-flung and exotic, I had not understood how he must have felt when leaving his home to go sail to distant ports. I have never entered natural landscapes or any part of nature with social or emotional consequences. Departing the old tends to offer one a look back over their shoulder. I never did that. Instead, I was entering a new world. Each author created their own truth of what it is like to experience nature. From the authors, I amassed fresh views and worthwhile knowledge, and an understanding of the multidimensional perspectives of nature. And that ends Chapter 2.